What you're about to hear are 5 of the scariest ideas mankind has ever shaped. Ideas so disturbing that libraries forget them, so dangerous that archives bury them, so monstrous that even the internet doesn't want you to find them. Open it, and you can't close it. You can only walk through, knowing that once you do, you will never unlearn what you've learned. Because some truths don't set you free. They consume you. The 5 philosophies we're about to reveal have shaped the shadow of humankind for centuries. They've inspired revolutions and suicides, created saints and monsters. They exist beyond right and wrong, lurking where no one is supposed to look. If you're still here, if you're still listening, then maybe you're ready. Or maybe you're just curious enough to walk into the dark. Either way, welcome to the edge. This is where it begins. The Aesthetics of Atrocity. Look closely at the ruins, not with the eyes of a witness, but with the eyes of a sculptor. What you'll find is an idea so monstrous it almost burns itself out of language, the idea that destruction can be beautiful. Not in the shallow sense of a beautiful tragedy we attach to films or books, but in the sense that cruelty itself can rise to the level of art. This is the Aesthetics of Atrocity, an obscure, buried school of thought that treats genocide, betrayal, collapse, every brutal distortion of the human experience as threads in a cosmic design. Not errors, not abominations, not even warnings, but raw material for something grander, darker, and unfathomably inhuman. Imagine a city reduced to ashes, not as a tragedy for its inhabitants, but as an expression of the universe, a statement about the nature of being. The old ruins of Dresden, the smoldering wreckage of Warsaw, the broken bones of countless civilizations. To the aesthetic of atrocity, these are not tragedies, but moments when the veil of ordinary life is ripped open, when beauty and horror fuse into one. Not because one justifies the other, not because the dead deserve their fate, but because the terror itself can be framed as a kind of brutal beauty, a glimpse into nature's absolute indifference. This way of seeing the world surfaced in whispers after countless atrocities, not in books sold openly, but in fragments buried in archives, condemned by those who discovered it. Its writers claimed that atrocities weren't just incidents, they were strokes upon a canvas, and that canvas was history itself. The flames that consumed cities, the bombs that shook the earth, the cruelty that shaped nations. To this way of thinking, they were moments when the world revealed itself fully. Not through mercy, not through love, but through sheer unstoppable force. Why is this scary? Because it doesn't justify atrocities. It doesn't claim that any genocide was good or necessary. It doesn't ask for forgiveness. It doesn't pretend the dead can be redeemed. What it suggests is that such moments can rise to the level of a terrible beauty, and beauty is seductive. The fear is that once you accept the possibility that cruelty can have an aesthetic, you risk accepting cruelty itself as a tool for making meaning. Consider Poland after World War II. The nation was ravaged, its people brutalized, its borders reshaped. Yet a strange fact emerged. Studies conducted decades later found that some Poles, despite or because of the trauma, developed a deeper sense of belonging and resilience. The ruins became fertile soil for belonging. The tragedy became part of their identity, and for some, that identity felt profound. What does this imply? That from the ashes of atrocity can arise strength. Not because atrocity was right, but because in its aftermath, people can transform themselves. The Aesthetics of Atrocity doesn't point to this as a lesson about ethics. It doesn't justify the horror. It exposes the paradox that beauty and cruelty can share the same space. Look at the photographs from Auschwitz, the black and white images of barbed wire and crumbling barracks. They haunt the collective psyche, not just because of the terror, but because of their brutal clarity. The sharp lines of the fences, the long shadows of the guard towers, these images have a formal, undeniable visual precision. They draw the eye, they embed themselves in the brain. The Aesthetics of Atrocity forces a question upon those brave enough to ask it. Can terror itself be a form of truth? Not truth in the sense of moral justification, but truth as in reality stripped bare. The bomb doesn't lie, the death camp doesn't pretend, the collapse doesn't disguise itself. It is ugly, monstrous, total. Yet precisely for this reason, it can reveal a deeper nature of the world, one that doesn't care about human virtue, one that operates beyond notions of right or wrong. Why was this school of thought buried? Not because it was false, not because it lacked evidence, but because its very suggestion threatens the foundation upon which ethics rests. What if cruelty can become a language? What if some moments are worth remembering precisely because of the ruin they left behind? These are ideas no one wants to entertain, because accepting them means accepting that the line between tragedy and transcendence is far thinner than we're taught. The Aesthetics of Atrocity doesn't ask for your agreement. It is a warning, a reminder that deep within the collapse of civilizations, within the flash of a rifle or the silence after a scream, there can reside a brutal, unfathomable beauty. Not to be embraced, but to be feared. Not to be forgotten, but to be remembered, precisely because it reminds us that the dark and the sacred can arise from the same seed. The Antinatalist Gnosis, the will to never be born. Stop for a moment and consider this thought. What if life itself was a mistake? Not your life, not mine. All of it, all life, not a gift, not a miracle, a disease, an error in the coding of the universe. This is the core of antinatalist gnosis, an ancient buried strain of thought that doesn't just oppose having children, it opposes existence itself. It doesn't seek a better world, it seeks no world at all. To its disciples, life is a parasite, not a beautiful accident, not a cosmic miracle, a parasite crawling across space and time, multiplying, consuming, spreading. They called it a metaphysical virus, not because it kills, but because it refuses to stop. To them, every new breath was an infection. Every new child was another link in a chain that should never have been forged. It doesn't pretend life can be fixed or improved or redeemed. It doesn't tolerate your excuses about purpose or the beauty of nature or the warmth of human connection. It doesn't try to save the world. Its goal is to end it. What separates antinatalist gnosis from every other doom theory is its simplicity, its brutal honesty, its refusal to justify itself. Its writers weren't madmen scrawling in deserted rooms. Some were philosophers, scholars, monks. They weren't trying to shock for the sake of shock. They were trying to warn, to bear witness to an error older than mankind, older than this planet, the error of being itself. Look to the Cathars, a forgotten sect in the Middle Ages that refused to bear children. Not because of poverty, not because of cruelty, but because of belief. To them, life was a prison built by a corrupt God. To continue life was to collaborate with this God. To bear a child was to drag another soul into captivity. The church hunted them down, exterminated them, not because their ideas were ridiculous, because their ideas were too potent, too dangerous. Look to modern data. Even in our era, when global poverty decreases and medical care improves, depression and suicide rates rise sharply. The paradox is not an accident. The paradox is the point. According to antinatalists, making life better doesn't fix the error. It only prolongs it. Why does this haunt us? Because it doesn't just attack institutions or ideas, it attacks life itself. Not with weapons, not with ideology, but with a quiet, brutal whisper. What if the best thing for all of us is that none of us had ever been? Antinatalist gnosis doesn't seek immortality, doesn't seek utopia, doesn't seek redemption. Its only goal is silence. Final silence. The end of sound, the end of thought, the end of being. Consider this. After World War II, in places like Poland and Germany, amid ruins and ashes, some survivors refused to have children. Not because they were broken, not because they were afraid, but because some looked upon the wreckage of history and concluded, objectively, undeniably, that to create more life was to risk more agony, more tragedy, more ruin. These weren't rebels or madmen. They were witness to the machinery of cruelty, and their silence was their reply. Modern antinatalists point to statistics every society tries to bury. In developed nations, suicide outpaces homicide. In certain years, it kills more than war. We don't speak of this openly. We shuffle the numbers and call them mental health crises. But some ask, what if this crisis is not an error? What if it's a signal, an alarm going off deep in the core of the species? What if life itself is telling us that it was a wrong turn, that this was never meant to continue? Antinatalist gnosis doesn't wear a black robe and call itself holy. It doesn't march with a banner. It doesn't ask for followers. Its message is quieter, darker. Stop. Stop creating. Stop multiplying. Stop feeding the machine that burns and breaks and kills. Stop opening the door for another generation of death. Religion, culture, family, progress. All of these collapse if you accept the antinatalist claim. It doesn't ask for mercy, it doesn't justify itself, it doesn't offer comfort. It just reminds you every second of pain is born from one decision, the decision to create, the error to continue. The antinatalist gnosis doesn't pretend to save the world. Its only offering is stillness. Its only promise is an end to this, to all of this, forever. And that is why this idea doesn't just haunt the archives. It stalks the edge of every thought. It waits, patient, knowing one thing, that if we ever truly listen, this machinery of being might finally stop. The deconstruction of the self. What if I told you that you don't exist, not as a theory? What if I told you it's literal, that every thought you call your own, every memory you claim as me, every moment of identity you cling to, is an illusion, not a broken one, not an error, not a distortion, an illusion by design. This is the heart of the deconstruction of the self, a strain of thought buried deep in obscure texts and forgotten archives. Not the safe academic deconstruction taught in classrooms, but a darker variant, one that doesn't stop at language or symbols, doesn't end with skepticism about politics or religion. This one goes further, straight into the core of consciousness itself. Why is it scary? Because it doesn't ask, "Who am I?" It replies, "There is no you at all." Here's the thought experiment. What if every experience you've ever had was a script? What if every thought, every desire, every belief, every fragment of ego, every piece of you was generated by a machine you can't comprehend? A biological one, an evolution-shaped organism that doesn't serve you, but uses you. What if your brain doesn't create a self, but an interface? What if you're not a person, but a program? Not a witness, not an operator, not an agent, an artifact. That's the terror of the deconstruction of the self. It doesn't kill your identity, it exposes that it was never alive. Look to history. The Khmer Rouge tried to eradicate individuality in the name of the collective. Pol Pot's regime treated every person as a node in an abstract machine. The results weren't just brutal, they were calculated. The idea of the I became meaningless, not punished, not reformed, erased. Closer still, think about the rise of digital algorithms. Today, you aren't a person online. You're a data point, an engagement metric, a prediction. The feed doesn't ask who you are. The feed tells you, shapes your thoughts, influences your emotions, constructs a you that fits its needs. What you call you is a product, a shell, a mask for something you can no longer recognize. What you call you is no longer yours. Modern psychology has confirmed parts of this. Neurobiology shows that the sensation of self can be altered or eliminated by damage to certain brain areas. Split brain patients have acted as if inhabited by two selves. Brain scans reveal that the I you call your identity emerges from countless microprocesses, none of which claim to be you. What does that imply? Not that you're complex, not that you're evolved, but that you're an accident, an emergent phenomenon, a ghost in a machine that doesn't believe in ghosts. The terror here doesn't come from death. Death is a door. The terror here is that no one was ever in the room. The terror is that you might already be gone, a witness to a story that doesn't belong to you. Its implication threatens every foundation of society. What is law if the person committing the crime doesn't exist? What is guilt if the self feeling it is only a cluster of memories? What is mercy if the being receiving it is a mist? What is immortality if the one dreaming of it was never real? The deconstruction of the self doesn't lead to an answer. It leads to a void, a terror of knowing too much, a terror that every person you've loved, every moment you've cherished, every version of yourself you've built, may be a page torn from a book that doesn't exist. Why does this matter? Because across the ages, moments have surfaced when this thought became reality. The cults that dissolved the individual for a collective identity, the totalitarian states that turned names into numbers, the corporate algorithms that reduce people to patterns. In every era, in every form, the same terror whispers. You are not a person. You are a process. You are a pattern. You are an illusion. And if that's true, then every conviction you've ever held, every belief about belonging, every judgment about worth, rests upon a foundation that was never there. This is the point where even the bravest turn away, not because it's too dark, but because it's too clear, too sharp, too absolute. The deconstruction of the self doesn't kill the you that you hold dear. It exposes that this you was never alive at all, and that, more than death, more than madness, is the terror that will haunt you long after these words end. The Theology of Oblivion. Here's the thought no one wants to say aloud. What if the only God that's real is the void? Not a God with a name, not a God with a face, not a God you can pray to or beg for mercy, a God that doesn't notice, doesn't care, doesn't listen, a God that doesn't even have a will because it doesn't need one. The Theology of Oblivion doesn't just kill the gods you learned to fear. It replaces them with silence, a silence that predates words, thoughts, and galaxies. This belief doesn't ask for offerings, doesn't ask for obedience, doesn't ask for love. Its central tenet is as simple as it is horrifying. Everything ends. Everything goes dark. Not just you, not just mankind, not just this planet, everything. All memories, all moments, every thought that has ever bubbled forth from consciousness, all of it disappears. Not into some holy paradise, not into some blazing hell, not into some misty afterlife. It disappears like a flame snuffed out in a room with no witness. Its only promise is an end to gods, to pain, to beauty, to cruelty, to knowing, an end to the very idea of end itself. Look to history. The ancient Gnostics spoke of a false god, a mad, blind architect called the Demiurge, and of a higher, unknowable force beyond him. But buried deeper still in texts too obscure for holy books is the whisper that even the highest god can dissolve, even the all can decay. What came before this universe? What comes after? The Theology of Oblivion doesn't ask for belief. It doesn't seek disciples. It waits. Closer still. Think about the ruins of civilizations. The Library of Alexandria was burned to the ground, its knowledge scattered like ashes. The ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, those first cradles of language and math, now lie buried under sand. The gods of Babylon, the gods of Assyria, the gods of countless forgotten nations, where are they? Their names? Forgotten. Their statues? Broken. Their stories? Reduced to fragments we can't piece together. This is an accident. This is the design. The long, slow breath of oblivion. The Theology of Oblivion doesn't call itself holy. It doesn't pretend immortality. Its claim is quieter, deeper, more absolute, that all things, thought, matter, dream, God, arise from silence and collapse back into it. That every prayer ends in silence. That every holy relic, every temple, every ritual eventually turns to dust. That silence doesn't fear sound. That silence consumes sound. Always. Modern physics whispers something similar. The heat death of the universe, the inevitable end where stars wink out, galaxies drift apart, and matter itself can no longer cling to form. The universe doesn't ascend to glory, it disintegrates into a cold, lightless tomb, not as theory, as prediction, not as terror, as fact. Why was this buried? Not because it was too obscure, not because it was too abstract, but because it threatens every belief we cling to. Not just religious belief, not just spiritual belief, all belief. The belief that life has a point, the belief that pain has a purpose, the belief that somewhere, somehow, someone remembers. The Theology of Oblivion doesn't kill your gods. It kills the need for gods. It kills the myth of immortality itself. Its threat is quiet, absolute. The threat that when the final moment arrives, when the lights wink out, when the stars collapse, when the universe exhales its last breath, there will be no witness. No witness. No remembrance. Not a witness for your victories, not a witness for your sins. Why does this matter? Because every era finds its ruin. Every holy site becomes dust. Every holy text finds its silence. The gods of the ancient world weren't defeated, they weren't replaced, they weren't conquered, they were forgotten. That is the terror at the heart of the Theology of Oblivion. Not judgment, not immortality, not glory, not even doom. The Theology of Oblivion doesn't ask for your belief. It doesn't ask for your obedience. It doesn't ask for anything at all. Its claim is darker, more patient, more absolute. In the end, every thought you have, every word you speak, every God you pray to, everything you build will be claimed, will be unmade, will be silenced, not as tragedy, not as punishment, not as mercy, as inevitability, as fact. That is the terror, not death, not judgment, not hell, not loss. The terror is knowing that in the end, silence wins. the philosophy of social nihilism. Here's a thought that doesn't just sting, it burns. What if every society you've ever believed in is a trap? Not a broken machine, not a corrupt version of itself, but a design. An engine that doesn't fail when it grinds down the human spirit, but one that succeeds precisely because it does. This is social nihilism, not an argument about bad leaders or failed policies, not about fixing institutions, not about making nations, families, or communities better. The philosopher of social nihilism doesn't want to fix anything because he knows the horror at the core, that belonging itself is a weapon, an assembly line that turns human potential into fuel for the collective, not to save it, not to uplift it, to consume it. Why is this scary? Because it doesn't propose an enemy. The enemy is belonging itself, the nation, the church, the family, all those cozy words you were taught as a child. Social nihilism strips their skin and shows you the beast underneath, not as error, not as accident, as design. Look at history, the First World War, the Second, the countless purges and genocide, the gulags, the death marches, not because a bad actor came to power, not because an ideology went too far, but because belonging became obedience, and obedience became sacrifice. The philosopher of social nihilism doesn't ask, why do nations kill? He asks, why do nations exist if not to kill? Not kill outsiders, not kill enemies, kill their own, always. In Stalinist Russia, tens of millions disappeared, not as a mistake, as a mechanism. The terror was not an accident. The terror was the point. The individual was reduced to an insect. The collective became a god, and every god must be fed. Same with Nazi Germany. Not a failed version of a society. The logical end of belonging, a people molded, shaped, and weaponized until belonging became obedience, obedience became fanaticism, and fanaticism became genocide. Closer to now, think about corporate culture, the open spaces, the forced team bonding, the loyalty to a brand, not because it needs you, but because it needs you gone, subsumed. Your ideas replaced with slogans, your voice drowned out by a mission statement. You're asked to belong, but belonging means one thing every time. Your individuality dies first. Social nihilism doesn't whisper that belonging can be saved. It shouts that belonging itself is the disease. Why bury this thought? Because it kills the sacred illusions. The idea that a nation can be holy, that a family can be a refuge, that a church can be a beacon. Social nihilism doesn't reject them because they've failed. It exposes that their very design demands obedience, demands sacrifice, demands psychic cannibalism. Look at the USSR, an ideology that promised a worker's paradise and delivered a graveyard. Not because Marx was wrong, not because Lenin or Stalin misunderstood him, because belonging itself became the weapon. The state didn't fail its people. The state used its people precisely as intended. Look at America, a beacon of democracy, where belonging means working yourself to death for a corporation, drowning in medical debt, and smiling as the market replaces God. The philosopher of social nihilism doesn't invite despair. He doesn't ask for revolution. He doesn't promise utopia. What he gives you is clarity. The clarity that every collective ideal is a machine for consuming the individual, not to uplift, not to educate, not to save, to erase. The scariest part? You already knew. Somewhere deep in the marrow of your bones, you felt it. At that job where you smiled as your ideas were ignored. At that family gathering where silence felt like obedience. At that rally where belonging felt like swallowing a shard of glass. You felt it then. You just refused to name it. That's social nihilism. Not a theory, not a trend, a diagnosis. A reminder that every collective ideal, every flag, every holy book, every anthem can only live by feeding on the self. Not because people are corrupt, not because leaders are tyrants, but because belonging, by its nature, demands the surrender of identity. Why was this buried? Not because it's false, not because it lacks evidence, but because it threatens the only thing every collective must maintain at all costs: the belief that belonging saves you, that belonging is holy, that belonging can be redeemed. Social nihilism doesn't kill that belief. It exposes the corpse it's been hiding. It forces you to ask the one question every tribe fears: if belonging is a poison, why am I still drinking? These ideas weren't buried by accident. They weren't lost because no one remembered them. They were buried because every society that uncovered them felt the same shiver down its spine. They're weapons aimed at the heart of belonging, belief, and identity. Weapons that don't kill bodies, but kill illusions. Throughout history, those in power have known this. The church buried antinatalist texts, the state silenced social nihilists, the academy ignored the deconstruction of the self. Not because these ideas were too obscure, too abstract, too niche, but because they were too dangerous, too potent, too tempting for minds teetering on the edge. They weren't buried because they were wrong. They were buried because too many people feared they might be right. And for a long time, that was probably a good thing. These ideas, if unleashed on the masses, can poison hope, dissolve belonging, shatter identity. They can make life feel like a mistake. They can justify cruelty, apathy, and despair. To bury them was an instinct for survival, an instinct that shaped civilizations, molded nations, and kept countless lives from tipping into the void. But here's the thought that won't die. What if that was also the error? What if by burying these ideas we gave ourselves a weaker armor? What if knowing the darkest truths is the only way to walk through the dark?